Do you know why so many software projects start feeling messy, even when the feature you're building doesn't seem that complicated? It's usually not because the code itself is impossible to write. It's because eventually you stop clearly understanding how the system is supposed to behave. What triggers the workflow, how the data moves through the system, what should happen before the request gets processed, what the backend is responsible for. And once that clarity starts disappearing, the project becomes much harder to move forward. So in this video, I want to show you how I personally think through features before I start implementing them. We will take one small feature, map the workflow visually, and break down what actually happens from the moment a user triggers an action all the way through the system. After working professionally as a developer for more than 10 years, one thing that helped me a lot was learning to slow down before implementation. Instead of jumping straight into coding, whether that's writing the code yourself or asking AI to generate it, I started mapping workflows visually first. So for this example, I partnered with Lucid Software to map this feature out visually. And honestly, once you can clearly see how a feature is supposed to behave, implementation starts feeling much more manageable. So instead of trying to think about an entire product all at once, let's focus on one small workflow. Let's say we're designing a task creation flow inside a project management platform. Nothing complicated, just one feature, creating a new task. And this is where a lot of developers accidentally make implementation harder than it needs to be. They immediately open the editor and start building pieces in isolation. The form, the API route, the database schema, the validation. But the problem is that they still haven't fully mapped out how the workflow itself behaves. But before writing a single line of code, I first want to understand the workflow itself. What triggers the process? What happens first? How does the data move through the system? And what should happen before the user sees the final result? So instead of starting from a blank canvas, I can describe the workflow in plain English first. Something like create a flow for creating a new task inside a project management platform. And this is where Lucid AI becomes genuinely useful. Instead of staring at a blank canvas, trying to organize everything manually, I can generate a rough workflow in seconds and immediately start refining the logic. Not because the AI magically solves the architecture for me, but because it gives me something visual to think against. Because now we can slow down, look at the flow, and start making better implementation decisions before even touching the code, refining the flow. And this is useful whether you're a newer developer, a more experienced developer planning a feature, or even someone trying to explain a workflow clearly to a team. So now that we already have the rough workflow structure, let's actually refine it properly. The first thing I want to understand is what is the actual trigger for the workflow. The user clicks the Add Task button. That's the starting point. Then the form opens, the user enters the task details and maybe a deadline, and instantly, just by visualizing the sequence step by step, the workflow becomes much easier to follow, because now we're no longer thinking about the entire product. We're focusing on one specific flow and understanding exactly how it behaves. Validation, decision point. And this is usually where small features start becoming much harder to maintain later on, because now we need to decide, do we trust the input immediately, or do we validate the data before the system processes anything? Should we send this task straight to the backend and save it immediately? Probably not. Before anything gets processed or stored, the system should first check whether the input is actually valid. For example, did the user enter a task title? Is the deadline in the right format? Is there enough information to create the task properly? So now we can add our first decision point to the flow. If the input is valid, the workflow continues. If not, we show a validation error and stop the flow right there. And this is where visualizing the workflow becomes really useful, because instead of discovering these logic gaps halfway through implementation, you can spot them much earlier while the flow is still easy to change. Backend and database flow. Now, once the input is valid, the workflow can continue. At this point, the frontend can send a post request to the backend services layer with the task information. And this is really the moment where the workflow moves from the frontend into the backend. The backend services layer is responsible for handling the business logic behind the feature. This is where the application decides, is the request valid? Does the user have permission? Should the task actually be created? And what data should finally be stored? And once those rules are processed, the backend stores the task record in the persistence layer. So in this case, it receives the task details, creates the new task, and then stores the task record inside the persistence layer. And the database is basically where the task lives after it's created. So if the user refreshes the page or comes back later, the task is still there. And once you see it like this, the feature becomes much easier to understand, right? The user triggers the action, the frontend checks the input, the backend processes the request, the database stores the result, and finally, the backend returns the response back to the UI, the interface refreshes, and the new task appears on screen. The big payoff. And to be honest, this is the part that changed the way I think about implementation completely. This is the real payoff. We still haven't written a single line of code, but already we understand what triggers the workflow, where the validation happens, what the frontend is responsible for, what the backend is responsible for, how the data moves through the system, and how the final result gets back to the user. And once you have that level of clarity, implementation stops feeling random, because experienced developers usually don't just jump into code and hope the architecture works itself out later. They reduce uncertainty first, and only then they implement. And even if you never use this exact workflow yourself, I hope this changes the way you think about building features. And honestly, that mindset shift alone can save developers an unbelievable amount of time, confusion, and messy rework later on. So if you want to try mapping your own workflows visually like this, you can check out Lucid Chart using the link in the description below. Huge thanks again to Lucid Software for partnering with me on this video. And hopefully now, workflows, front-end, back-end communication, and implementation planning feel a little more structured and easier to visualize. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like and watch this one next, because it will help you think about projects and implementation in a much more practical way. Thanks for watching, you legends. I'm Pete, and I'll see you on the next one.